How many of you have been to a lion exhibit at the zoo? Yeah. So there's this one time, you can put your hands down. There's one time where my family, we went to a zoo. I don't even remember what zoo it was. But since we were at the zoo, it's kind of like a thing where if you're at a zoo, you have to go see the lions, I feel like. Even though lions aren't really very exciting. I feel like every time I've been around a lion enclosure, they just kind of sit around on rocks. They don't really do anything. But there's this one time we went to a zoo, and these lions were actually pretty active. And so there were a lot of people crowded up around the enclosure. It was very loud, very busy. And so my family, we got up there just to kind of check out the action. And, after a little bit, it was like, okay, there's a lot of people here. So we moved back and we watched from afar. And it's a good thing we did because this particular day, at this particular moment, the lion was not very happy. It was a hot day. There were a bunch of people outside of his enclosure that were just, screaming and yelling. And so the lion got up as close to this large group of people as he could. He turned around, lifted his tail, and projectile pooped over the entire crowd in front of the enclosure. I'm not making this up. I watched this happen. And so all of the kids that were just standing there watching the lion, they now have lion feces all over them. It was disgusting, and I'm glad I moved away from the enclosure. Needless to say, they didn't stick around very long after that. It kind of cleared out after that point. But lions are not to be messed with, and we know that, right? We've seen the nature documentaries. We know that lions are the king of the jungle, even though they don't live in the jungle. They live in the savannah. And for some reason, when lions are domesticated, we kind of feel like we don't have to deal with the wild nature of a lion because it's there in a cage. We don't have to worry about it. But that's just not true because lions, even though they are domesticated in zoos, lions still do lion things. And Satan is referred to in the Bible as a lion that's trying to pounce on us, that's a lion that's trying to destroy us. And those who follow the ways of the world, they fall into the dark ways of Satan, the ways of the lion. Lions do lion things. And even in everyday situations, if we are around those people who have given themselves to the world, those situations can become dangerous. And Daniel, he understood this well. He was taken from his home by the Babylonian Empire, and eventually the Persian Empire took over the Babylonian Empire, and Daniel has just continued to serve under the Babylonian Empire and now the Persian Empire. As we've seen in really the stories we've gone through in the book of Daniel, Daniel, he finds favor with God. He finds favor with the rulers of whatever kingdom he's under, but he along the way. And as we see the story that this book is probably most well known for, and it's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And not only is it the most famous story in the book, but it also ends the story portion of the book of Daniel. Daniel is 12 chapters long, and this is chapter 6, so we're halfway through. And the second half of this book is all about the prophecies that Daniel had during his lifetime. And so tonight, we are going to finish the story of Daniel, and then we're going to have one more week next week to finish out our series. But as we find out how Daniel's story ends, he's going to deal with some vicious lions, both human lions and animal lions. And he's going to show us what it looks like to create a culture of resilience, a culture of courage and strength in our own lives and in our faith. In the beginning of this chapter, it serves as a reminder that our world is full of darkness. Whether we realize it or not, there is this constant spiritual battle that's happening, and we are constantly having to decide what we are going to do with the darkness that is trying to influence us. I need to put down, please. Put down on the floor. Thank you. Daniel, he had to deal with the darkness in his life as well. He found favor with this new king, King Darius. And Darius, he over really the whatever part of the kingdom that was, he planned to set him over the whole realm. And there were some smaller rulers that Daniel had been ruling alongside that were not very happy about this. They were kind of jealous. So that they come up with this plan in verses 4 through 5 of chapter 6. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." And so these guys convinced to create this law that for 30 days, people were not allowed to seek their own gods. They were not allowed to seek other people. They had to seek the king. And if they didn't seek, immediately thrown into the lion's den. And Darius, not really much of this, says, okay, yeah, cool, sounds good, let's do it. And so he writes up this law, and we see Daniel's response to this law in verses 10 through 16. It says, when Daniel, the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day, down on his knees, prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men the group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, the person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and the is irrevocable, replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. He was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. But then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it's a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel, threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. So no matter where we are, darkness is going to try to overpower us. And the thing is, those who follow the ways of the world, they don't really like God. They don't like God's people is because we are strange. Or at least we should be strange. We shouldn't live like the rest of the world, and that throws people off. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them jealous. And Daniel, he made some people uncomfortable. He made people jealous. And they went after him because lions do lion things. And so they tried to trap him by creating this new law that would keep Daniel from worshiping God, but they knew he wasn't going to follow it. And so they knew they could get him in trouble in this way. Now Daniel has to choose law that or this that Darius has created. And so the question for us is, when worldly forces in our lives might pull us away from God, what will we do? How seriously do you take God when the world shoves its own priorities in your way? When your after-school activities interfere with your ability to grow in your faith, to invest in the church and find meaningful to Christ, at least some of them. When your teacher asks you to read a classic book that encourages sinful thoughts in you, when you read it, are you willing to set the book aside and take a hit to your grade because you don't want to fill your mind with it? When our parents keep us from coming to church, maybe for a good reason or for a bad reason, are we willing to sacrifice our own time to be intentional and spend time with God more seriously than anything else in our lives? And Daniel did. And similar to Daniel, in the face of darkness, we must choose to stay faithful to God. We must choose to stay. Instead of obeying this law, this new law that the king makes, Daniel, he, as we read, follows God's law. He disobeys this new law, and he worships in private not once, not twice, but 3 times a day. Not because that was something that was commanded of him, not because he had to, or God said he had to do that, but because he wanted to. He wanted to spend that much time to continually go to God again and again and again throughout his day. And if you're anything like me when I was your age, that's not really something you think about, right? You just kind of go through your day, you coast, do whatever you do. You know, you got to go to this class, you got to go to that class. Okay, now you have an after-school activity. So now we go and we do that, and we don't really take time to think about the presence of God in the midst of all of these normal things that are happening. But the truth is, we can approach God everyday things. I have this book. It's called Every Moment Holy. There are a few of them. But these books are really just a collection of prayers. Prayers that you can read through random events in your life, just whatever it might be. And so I thought I'd pick you guys a pretty short one just to give you an example of what these prayers are. But this prayer I picked out is a prayer that you might pray upon randomly thinking of another person. So maybe I think of him, or I think of you guys. And when I think of that, I pray for you guys. And what it says is, God, as I hold so-and-so a moment in my thoughts, I ask that you would hold them eternally in yours, being ever at work in their heart and life, even now directing their paths toward your good ends. As simple as that. We can just say in a moment. It doesn't take very long, and this is not the only way to do it. You don't have to have this book to approach God and talk with him on a regular basis throughout your day, but that's just one example of all of the many sorts of things you could pray about. And imagine what that would make your life look like. Imagine how it would transform your life. I imagine we would be closer with God, and we would know a little better what it means to journey with him, to walk with him if we are spending time with him throughout our day over and over and over again, just as Daniel did. But we see that Daniel eventually caught living this way, and there were some consequences. And the consequence was, of course, that he was going to be thrown into the lion's den. And as we've established, lions are not to be messed up on you. But here goes Daniel right into their very home because of his faith. And so we all have to ask the question, when you choose God over the things of this world, are you willing to deal with the consequences? Are you willing to experience the kind of that might lead in parts of your life? Are you willing to say no to a party that you know will involve underage drinking and drug use and risk being kicked out of that friend group, risk being just kind of moved out of that group of people you usually hang with, or risk losing some cool points? Are you willing to say no to watching an inappropriate movie that maybe your family or your friends want to watch on that story, risking missing out on time with your friends, family, the people that you enjoy being around? Are you willing to forgive those who have hurt you and to give you might to get back at them? See, we live in a world that is full of darkness that tries to pull us in. All some difficult decisions, but we have to be resilient to God and resist Satan and the other lions out there that are trying to destroy us. But you know, Satan isn't the only one in the Bible described as a lion. There is another lion in the Bible, and who is described as the Lion of Judah, who would bring darkness to an end, who would cause evil. And so even though our world is full of darkness, our God is full of power. And he puts that saving power on display in verses 19 through 26. It says, "At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. 'Daniel, servant of the living God,' the king said, 'has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?' Then Daniel spoke with the king. 'May the king live forever. God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm.' The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then and those men who had were brought and thrown into lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, may your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. So God's power can save us. Locked in a lion's den for an entire night, he survived. He wasn't even harmed. He didn't have a scratch on him, and that's all because of God. God rescued Daniel in that moment. He rescued certain death. And because God rescued him from certain death, Daniel was ruled innocent. The Darius. And we know that God is able to save us in the face of certain death as well. And, we've done wrong, have sinned against God. We've sinned against others. And because of that, we all deserve to die. But Jesus, he came in and he served as for us so that we didn't have to take on that suffering, but so that we could be saved from that sin, so that we could be saved from that darkness, from that evil, and we give your life, still going to struggle with sin. And there's a possibility that we will die before Jesus returns, but even if that's the case, if we are found in God, given our life to Jesus, we are considered clean, even when we sin, and we're going to find eternal life with God, even if we do die before Jesus returns. And not only is God able to rescue us, but God's power puts darkness in its place. When Daniel's brought out of the who goes in? The bad guys. Those who tried to get him in there, to get him in trouble in the first place. But who else goes in with the bad guys? Their families. Their families. Meaning, the family line where that sin, that wrongdoing came from, is being completely eliminated. It's being completely destroyed. That family line is not going to be able to hurt anyone anymore because they have all been thrown into the lion's den. And when Jesus returns, that's what he's going to do to evil. In a way, he is going to cut off the family line. He's going to end the family line entirely. And those who are God's enemies, they will be cast into hell, and Satan will be cast into hell. He will not rule hell. He will suffer too, and God will bring justice, and he will find victory over all darkness. And just like how we will praise God at the end of all things, God uses Darius to glorify him. And he establishes this new law. The people of Persia, of Media, must praise God. They must fear the God of Daniel. And we find at the very end, in the last verse, that Daniel continues to prosper of King Darius. And that is essentially the end of the story of Daniel. So, this life is difficult, yeah? There are things that we struggle with. There are things that we run into. And there are times where we are going to have to choose between God and the world. And sometimes that decision is going to be really tough because the things of this world aren't necessarily always bad things. There are some things that exist in this world that are good, that are blessings from God, but we might have to choose God above those good things. And when we do that, sometimes the world's going to because lions do lion things. And in those moments, we're going to need to be resilient. We're going to need to be tough. But before we are able to be resilient, we actually have to allow ourselves to get into situations that require us to be resilient. And Christians in America, we have trouble with this, right? Like, we live in a country where we are basically given every single luxury or comfort that we could imagine. We have access to those things if we want them. And so why would we put ourselves in an uncomfortable situation? Why would we put ourselves in a situation where we would need to be resilient? That doesn't seem to avoid danger. We try to avoid darkness. We try to avoid suffering. So why would we put ourselves in a situation or allow ourselves to be in a situation where we have to be resilient? Well, lucky for us, the Bible tells us. As we hop to the New Testament for just a moment, the book of Romans in chapter 5, it tells us exactly why. In verse 3 through 4, it says, "And not only that, but we also boast in our afflictions, our sufferings, the things that we struggle in, because we know that affliction produces endurance. Endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope." And hope is something that we are going to talk about next week when we finish up this series. But I want to leave you this week by encouraging you and reminding you that no matter what you are dealing with, no matter what difficult decisions you have to make today, this week, this month, this year, no matter what you are facing in your own life, when darkness seems to overpower you, have faith in God's power. Because, just as Darius says in his praise at the end of this chapter, "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end." So have hope in God. Be resilient in your faith, because he is powerful.